hang out with you.
Oh, say shalom, shalom, bimromav. Oh, say shalom, shalom, bimromav. Oh, say shalom, shalom, bimromav. Say shalom, shalom imromav. Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu be'al kol Israel imru amen. Shalom, shalom aleinu be'akol, be'akol yoshvei tevel. Hopefully we had enough time for everybody to be able to join in. Boker Tov.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to this morning's webinar and thank you for your patience. I'm Lisa Armoni, and I'm the director of the Rose Project and Senior Director of Community Relations at Jewish Federation of Orange County. I don't need to tell you that we are living in truly challenging times, the likes of which I doubt many of us, most of us, have experienced before. We're in the midst of an international pandemic that has claimed more than 100,000 souls in our country and hundreds of thousands more worldwide, while making millions of people ill. And at the same time, it's wreaking havoc on our economy and sending countless people into financial distress. While we continue to deal with the many difficulties associated with our need to shelter at home, an unspeakable crime took place in Minneapolis that rendered our national nerve raw and brought once again to the surface our country's lamentable history of systemic injustice towards the African American community. We've seen hundreds of peaceful protests around the country, expressions of solidarity with our African American neighbors, and demands for impactful change. But sadly, in some cases, individuals with ill intentions have taken advantage of the activity in the streets to engage in acts of vandalism, looting, and lawlessness targeting business institutions, including Jewish institutions. In Los Angeles and elsewhere, Jewish buildings have been damaged or destroyed or tagged with anti-Semitic slogans. Many communities are asking, how do we respond as Americans and as Jews to the injustice against our African American neighbors on the one hand, and to the anti-Semitic expressions and the destruction of Jewish institutions on the other? As Jews, we're obligated to stand with others in pursuit of justice, but also to stand to protect ourselves. These questions are igniting passions and at times heated debates in our communities because they speak to many of our core Jewish values. 2 years ago, the Rose Project of Jewish Federation launched a community-wide initiative in partnership with the Shalom Hartman Institute in an effort to empower our community with tools to engage civilly and respectfully on issues that most divide us. This work, which included the participation of 11 Orange County congregations and more than 300 learners, encouraged us to engage not in political debate, but in explorations of the values that animate our political choices. These values form the foundation of what unites us, even if they lead to different political conclusions. And once we can see and appreciate that common ground, we can acquire the ability to truly hear each other so that we can remain in community despite our disagreements. It's in this spirit today that we welcome Rabbi Adam Kligfeld, Senior Rabbi at Temple Beth Am in Los Angeles. We've asked him to share his unique insights and experience as we continue to navigate the challenge that lies in front of us today. Rabbi Kligfeld was ordained in 2000 at the Jewish Theological Seminary and served as a rabbi in New York before coming to Temple Beth Am in 2009. He's had many prestigious fellowships and important roles in the conservative movement. He'll be in conversation today with my friend and colleague, Rabbi Nico Socolovsky of Temple Beth Tikvah in Fullerton. Thank you, Rabbi Kligfeld, for being with our Orange County community today, and thank you, Nico, for facilitating today's conversation. I'm now going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Lisa. Boker Tov, everyone. Thank you for being here. Kavod Rav Kligfeld, thank you for being here. We really appreciate your willingness to share with us of your wisdom and insight. And I will go directly into sharing some of the questions that came up after having conversations over the last week, and particularly after reading your article that you titled, "We Must Sweep Away the Racism Along with the Broken Glass." You wrote there, "Each morning, it seems we are walking up to a different city than the one we lived in a few days ago. We were afraid, justifiably, over the last few nights, for our well-being, for our neighborhoods, for our schools. There is a reason to fear that the unrest may still impact us." Now, your synagogue is in La Ciénaga and Pico Boulevard. And we would like to start our conversation by asking you if you can relate what it's like, or what it was like, this different city that you are describing over the last couple of days in your article.
Certainly, Rabbi Nico, and thanks again for the invitation. This is a little retro for me because the last time I did anything involved with the Jewish Federation of Orange County, it was Orange County, New York, where I served for 9 years before coming to Los Angeles. So it's nice to be back in a conversation with Orange County Jewish Federation, just a different Orange County. I wrote those words on Sunday morning, and the world has changed over many times since then. We were kind of waking up from a Shabbat where those of us who were Shabbat observant were aware that something was very, very different. Helicopters were over our house for hours and hours and hours on Shabbat afternoon. We were 3 blocks away from the protesters and the rioting down 3rd Street. We could see the people going by. We could smell some of the tear gas and the fires from both looting and police cars on fire. And when we woke up on Sunday morning, it looked like what we imagine cities that are suffering tremendous blight or warfare might look like. The first thing we did as a community was ensure that our campus was intact, and it was. I know there was a version of this email that went out that suggested that our synagogue was vandalized and looted. It wasn't, but it almost felt like the Malach HaMavet, the angel of death, which I know says it strongly, passed over us because the strip mall a couple of hundred feet to the north of us and a couple of hundred feet to the south of us were looted, stores smashed in, Verizon stores totally broken down, and several small business owners really devastated, which meant that that version of the protest turned riot literally walked right by our building and chose not to do anything about it, and we felt grateful for that. So I wrote this to let the community know that I understood their fear, and I also understood the righteousness of the protests before the protests turned into something more dangerous, and that I thought our first obligation, particularly because our campus was spared, was to find partnership with as many people as possible in our community who want to focus energies on doing the right and the good to end racial injustice, and to listen deeper than we've listened before, to partner more open-heartedly than we had before, and not to ignore the fact that other neighbors of ours, whatever race they're from, because it doesn't matter to me, were truly devastated, with livelihoods impacted significantly, and spent the night in literal fear. My in-laws live about 50 feet away from the bank on the corner of La Cienega and Wilshire, where our family happens to do banking, that was utterly devastated. They didn't get into the safe, but it's pretty amazing, and not in a good way, to see a bank that has been broken into, which meant that whatever group of people were going by there were just a couple of footsteps away from where my in-laws sleep every night. That's scary. And what I wanted to communicate to the community was that it is possible to nimbly, uncomfortably, in a weighed down way, hold on to both convictions at the same time, that we can extend our hand to a righteous cause and also, without any guilt, without any self-flagellation, defend our property, defend our neighborhood, and certainly be empathic towards people whose lives and livelihoods were severely damaged by what happened on Saturday night. That was all on Sunday. Since then, the rioting in Los Angeles, as you know, has both moved from neighborhood to neighborhood a little bit, as have the protests, and also has the rioting part, as far as I understand, has diminished a little bit. And I participated in one of the rallies downtown, a peaceful protest downtown on Wednesday, trying to add my voice to the part of this message that resonates with me powerfully as a Jew, as an Angelino, as an American, as a human being.
Thank you. Thank you. And you already share some of the things that I actually want to explore further with you that has to do with this idea of holding two sets of truth. But we'll get into that in a few more moments. And before we go in that direction, there's something that you wrote in your article, and I will read that pretty much says that there's a very different experience from a Jewish perspective to what Los Angeles might be, or I might be misreading you. So I want to read this with you, for you, and ask further. And we must also confront the fact that so many in our society, just because of the color of their skin and the accident of their birth, are afraid many nights for their well-being, for their neighborhoods, and for their livelihoods. That sentence, and actually in the context in which you brought that sentence, was in a comparative context. So what is like to be a Jew in Los Angeles? What is the experience of a Jew in Los Angeles in terms of safety and tranquility in, I would say, normal weeks?
So rather than set it up as a binary, I sort of looking at it as a more intricate Venn diagram. On the one hand, I do believe that it's still the case that even with all of the headlines and articles and hand-wringing over the last few years about anti-Semitism, right? Remember when that was the scourge that we were all focusing on? That it's still the case that to be a Jew in the city of Los Angeles in 2020 is one of the most fortunate moments ever for a Jew to live anywhere, right? We are a community of vigor, of vitality. We're a community where we live in a city and a state in the country where the formal policy of government is to support the Jews and the Jewish community and the Jewish institutions. We have both sufficient affluence such that we can support our institutions and even support the members of our community who don't have the means, and also sufficient social consciousness that we can join the other members of the American community in trying to do good in the world outside of our borders. And I think that particularly for the modern, all parts of the modern Jewish community, for the moment I'm excluding the Haredi community, not because they're not my brothers and sisters, but I would include them in this category, the ultra-Orthodox. We find a way to be both beautifully particular and focusing on ourselves and our message and our buildings and our Torah and our texts and our teaching and our energy and our camps and our schools, and particularly universal, sufficiently universal, listening to the call from the Torah and from the prophets that to live a Jew is to not to live only as a Jew. But we're extremely fortunate, right? We're extremely privileged in the lowercase p, not overly politicized version of that word. We have tremendous privilege. It's also the case that the Los Angeles Jewish community, as many Jewish communities around the country, look different widely than they did 10 years ago and 20 years ago, with armed guards in front of nearly every synagogue, which had been normative and de rigueur in Europe and in Australia for many years. But when I came to the synagogue in 2009, it would have been unfathomable for someone to suggest that we would have armed guard outside of our synagogue. And now it's hard to imagine feeling safe walking to a synagogue without it. So I think that the Jewish community ends up sitting in several different fulcrums here. On the one hand, when it comes to whether or not individual Jews are targeted by police brutality or fear for their lives when they go out at night, blessedly, I would say that answer is no, if they don't, unless they are Black, in which case their Jewishness does not protect them from that. When it comes to still being a minority against whom there is tremendous, virulent, organized hatred, and some of that hatred expressed in some of the intersectionality that emerges from some of the otherwise righteous posturing and protesting that is going on right now, I would say that we also have something in common with aggrieved groups. And it's all a mixture, because when you come into a synagogue on a Saturday morning and people are dressed nicely and there's a beautiful kiddush and the air conditioner is working well, no one is thinking about themselves as under attack. But of course, anti-Semitism is older than race-flavored hatred, and sadly will persist. And it's both alongside that and because of that I think our consciousness has to be awakened when others who are treated mercilessly as a result of simply who they are under that spotlight. To quote Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, racism is an illness of the eye. It's an illness of the eye. It suggests that pixels and pigments say anything about the character of the person. Anti-Semitism is not an illness of the eye, it's an illness of something else. They are cousin illnesses. And we can both, I believe, proudly and defiantly fight against the illness that attacks our people while standing hand in hand fighting against the illness that attacks so many other. And I'll add one more sentence, particularly because there are people in both categories. We are at Temple Beth Am, and I'm sure many of the communities who are watching right now, hopefully a multi-chrome Jewish community. There are people of color, of all colors in our community. And we've been speaking as a Temple Beth Am community in the last few days, how on the one hand, we're proud of the fact that when Black members of our community walk into our building, their Blackness does not obtain. It's not relevant to how they're embraced, how they're, where they daven, to the extent to which they're a part of our community. We like to think that we are benighted and we can see past that. But of course, as soon as they walk out of Temple Beth Am, their Blackness in the city of Los Angeles has them be a target in a way that I will never experience in my life as a white man in Los Angeles. I might experience a version of that in my life as a Jew in some other parts of the world, but as a white man in Los Angeles, I'll never experience that.
Thank you. You know, in a personal level, in my family, we had an interesting reflection. I asked my children if they thought that there was any difference between white and black people, and the answer was a straight no. There are no differences. And I asked further to my 10 years old, and he said, well, we're all created in the image of God. And I, for 5 seconds, thought, oh my God, we are doing such a great job. But then I realized, 5 seconds later, that we are also developing blind spots.
Correct.
Like that the fact that he believes that we are all equal is fantastic. But with that belief, we also need to develop the ability to see that the life experiences of our brothers and sisters of different skin color are very, very, very different. I want to go back to your article, and you started to talk about this right with your last answer, this ability to hold universalism and particularism. You say, we will not solve this century's old societal malady, imbalance, injustice and conflict today or this week. We, as the extended Jewish community, will not ourselves bring peace to Los Angeles or the nation, but we also cannot refrain from our duty to do the right and the good, to listen to others' pain, and to call out injustice when it is obvious. and call out and refuse to tolerate lawlessness when it spills out from the righteous and legally protected protest. We cannot stand idly by and wait for others to do tikkun, the sacred role of fixing what is broken. And in this idea, you were able to bring these two pieces of truth together beautifully. And I can tell you that in many discussions in which I participated over the last week, we couldn't. We couldn't find that connection between the universal approach and the particular approach. I was thinking about this conversation between Rabbi Akiva and Ben Zoma, in which they ask what's the most important principle in the entire Torah. And Rabbi Akiva's answer is, "Ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha," you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And the idea behind of loving your neighbor as yourself is that your neighbor has to do with your location. So somehow your neighbor is related to you and you can pick and choose. In California, and you don't know that in Los Angeles, but here in Orange County, we live in gated communities or we live in separated communities. So we can actually select our neighbors and it's beautiful to love them. But that's your very particular choice. And when Ben Zoma is asked what's the most important principle, he says, "Sefer Toldot Adam, Adam nivra b'tzelem Elohim." This is the book of the offspring of humanity. Adam, human beings, were created in the image of God, saying that you don't get to pick. It's about everyone. You are supposed to care for everyone. And this, we should care for everyone. We should apply our Jewish values, thinking about everyone in this world, everyone in our cities. And no. We should think about first our neighbors and first what's happening to our communities. It's a very, very strong discussion and duality. And with that, you were able to bring that duality together beautifully. And I wanted to ask you, as a rabbi, how do you manage to emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually hold to these two truths and experiences of particularism and universalism? And I will say, in the context of your synagogue being in the middle of this thing that you could say, well, this is now just about us. Because
Thank you for the question, because the question was wonderful to listen to as its own sermon. We don't care about everyone the same way. We just don't. We love in concentric circles. I have an extended family tree, and I'm blessed to know my third cousins and some of my fourth cousins. I don't know my fifth cousins, and I don't know my sixth cousins. At some point, the human ability to care as much dissipates. It's like it has like a half-life over as you stretch out in a family tree. There's a reason why our tradition believes in monogamy. You commit to one person and you put all of your attention there, rather than bifurcating or trifurcating or quadrificating your attention. At the same time, as I try to live a righteous life and care about the issues of the world, there are plenty of aggrieved people on the planet that not only do I not protest for or write about, I'm not even aware of. It's impossible. Right? But we also, there's so many sources in our tradition that prohibit us from holding back, from trying to contribute to the issues that we are aware of, even though we are pretty certain that we're not going to be able to get to all of them comprehensively. And there are several places in our community where several texts in our community that instruct us, right? We celebrate really 2 Rosh Hashanahs in the year, although we only call one of them as a Rosh Hashanah. So Rosh Hashanah, even though it's observed, as you know, as a very particular holiday, with Jews going to Jewish synagogues, reading Jewish texts from Jewish prayer books, and having Jewish rituals, is celebrating not the Jewish people in Rosh Hashanah, but Hayom Harat Olam. Today is the birthday of the world. And so much of the imagery, as the Jews are gathering on this very, very Jewy of days, is focusing on the fact that we're part of a greater humanity. That's a Ben Zoma holiday, right? We turn the Jewish odometer from 5780 to 5781 on Rosh Hashanah to suggest that's how we're marking the time since Adam and Eve, as it were, Kiviyachol, right? Pesach is the Rosh Hashanah for the Jewish people, because that's when we celebrate the birth of the Jewish people and God saving the Jewish people and our coalescing under the rule of law as a Jewish people. And we also have a very, very Jewish holiday, which of course we've borrowed from a non-Jewish secular Greek paradigm. So even our metaphors about which of our holidays are particular and universal are mixed. I think that we are somehow obligated to do both simultaneously, and what I try not to do is to constantly guilt myself regarding the universal causes that I haven't yet put my attention to, because it's a Sisyphean task. There are many more good tzedakot I haven't contributed to, good petitions I haven't signed, aggrieved people I have not individually supported, justice causes that I haven't rabbinically stood behind than the ones that I have done, because all of us have only a certain bandwidth, but that limited bandwidth, you can't you're not permitted to pull back from focusing on it, even though you're not going to individually fix it. It would have been, if we imagine this moment in a non-COVID world, which I know is impossible because somehow this is all related, but if we imagine that the horrible death of George Floyd and the protests and the riots that continued after that were happening in a world where the following Shabbat, after the boards off the synagogue had come off, the buildings would have been once again guarded by armed guards, and 100 or 200 or 300 or 400 and 500 people would have showed up in synagogue. It would have been easy and convenient and even normative and okay if by the second Shabbat or the third Shabbat, this Shabbat, we're going to focus on Shabbat. And this Shabbat, we're going to focus on Mikey Goldstein and his bar mitzvah. And this Shabbat, we're going to focus on the great class that Rabbi so-and-so is offering next week. Because at some point, you can't live in crisis forever, even when you're trying to contribute to the good in society. But what we're trying to do as a synagogue, as I know so many synagogues are trying to do, is to resist the convenient urge to pendulum swing back to normalcy, because our Black brothers and sisters cannot, and too often these protests and riots yield to a normalcy that perpetuates the very societal problems that will lead to the next riot and the next broken glass 5, 10, 15 years down the line. So somehow we have to do both. May has turned into June, and in July, it's hard to imagine where we're going to be in this moment, but we're not going to be in this acute moment. It'll have been flattened out, and who knows how many national headlines will have eclipsed this one. We are foolish if we can prophesy and imagine that we're certain what the headlines are going to be on July 1st. But I hope that whatever the headlines are on July 1st, whatever is happening with COVID, whatever is happening with our Jewish communities and our board meetings and our synagogues and our fundraising and our B'nai Mitzvah, that we're still attending to this illness in our society in a way that shows that we have staying power in this issue, and we have stamina to stick with it, not only when it's impacting our block, but because it's still impacting our consciousness and our conscience.
Thank you. And you in your article you say that when Jews see broken glass, it brings us to a very particular place. And I would say that, our collective memory is very strong in that sense. And it's very hard to move away from that place of collective memory. I grew up in a congregation that was founded by a rabbi who was a student of Leo Beck. And I don't know if you're familiar with the legend of Leo Beck giving to his students stones and telling them, go and build congregations. My rabbi, Hans Harf, built two. So and broken glass in our mind was always, and because that's when this conversation and this story happened, was always the moment in which you say, well, this is the beginning of the end. So that's where we go in our collective memory. But next to that, in the same paragraph, you use that concept that you almost said now and you didn't, And so I want to bring that concept, but we should be careful, you say, of being conveniently righteous. Conveniently righteous, which has to do with how we balance Jewish values, I guess. But I would like for you to share what is this idea of the collective memory and being conveniently righteous, and what is to be conveniently righteous.
Broken glass is evocative in our tradition. I had more than one member email me Sunday morning and tell me this feels like Kristallnacht. They weren't, they know it wasn't Kristallnacht, but the way trauma is passed, exists in an individual human and is passed on in kind of a communally genetic way, not actually genetic, but a communally genetic way. When there's glass breaking and windows being shattered in and around Jewish communities, and you're of an Ashkenazi Jewish heritage and your parents lived through it, it can feel like it's Kristallnacht adjacent, even when the Jewish community wasn't specifically being targeted, and even though this was not a pogrom, and to call it a pogrom, I think would be a bastardization of the word. But we're living in an era where someone's truth is their truth and someone's experience of a microaggression is a microaggression. And members of my community woke up saying, Rabbi Kligfeld, I feel like I'm in Kristallnacht. And a Kristallnacht moment is a gathering, circling the wagons moment, right? If you think about the Rabbi David Hartman's paradigm of Auschwitz versus Sinai, right? Two powerful forces in the Jewish psyche. The Auschwitz paradigm is they're coming to get us. We have to protect ourselves. We are still a grieved minority. The Sinai paradigm is our raison d'etre is to spread light to the world. And when Auschwitz is louder than Sinai, we're in a flight or fight mode and we're not at our best. And when Sinai is occluding Auschwitz, we're forgetting to protect ourselves. So Sunday morning for many in our community was a bit of an Auschwitz moment. And I understood why, right? What I try to communicate back to my community is that we have to sweep up others' glass and not just our own. And I linked it in an event we had in our community. We had a Zoom event Sunday night to kind of process this, where I talked about what I tell nearly every wedding couple I speak to about the broken glass under the chuppah, which is also, I believe, a moment replete with more than one simple emotion. The classic explanation is Na'aleh et Yerushalayim al rosh simchatenu. We will elevate our memory of a destroyed Jerusalem even into the moment of our highest joy. And so when a couple marries one another and begins to build hopefully a next generation of Jews, we say, yes, oy abrach, the Jews have had it hard. We dare not forget 586 BCE and 70 and Kristallnacht, as it were, right? At the same time, I tell couples that there's, at least for me, another import to that broken glass, that after we test the relative strength of the groom's ankle, and he breaks the glass into innumerable pieces that cannot be really put back together, I say to them under the chuppah that you are sadly getting married and building love and building a family in a broken world. You are inheriting that, even if you didn't directly cause it. And one of our high hopes for you is that you as a Jewish couple will take your love and apply it towards, yes, the Sisyphean task that will never be perfectly completed of trying to put that broken glass back together. And that's not just broken Jewish glass. It's also broken Jewish glass, but it's the broken glass of the Verizon store and the broken glass of the Chase Bank and the broken glass of the Black communities in Los Angeles and around the country who do not have the peace that we sometimes take for granted. And I think we have to allow our hands to get heavy and dirty, but hopefully not bloodied, as we literally sweep up the glass of our proverbial windows and their proverbial shattered lives. We have to do that simultaneously. If we only do the former, I think that we are conveniently righteous and conveniently outraged. We're outraged when the anger is turned towards us, and we're righteous when we are the ones who are exposed. By the way, I also think there is inexcusable, convenient righteousness in the other direction, right? When the American Jewish community or the progressive Jewish community, of which I'm a proud member, is only righteous about the grievances of the Black community and shunts anti-Semitism to the side at best, or contributes to it at worst. I think there is hypocritical, convenient righteousness on both sides. But I think that we have to hold ourselves so that we don't diminish ourselves into that place, because it feels defensible once we're in it, but it's not beautiful to look at from the outside.
and you took it one step further. And when on Sunday morning, you write, Sunday morning, members of my shul, Temple Betam, along with many members of my local Jewish communities, spent hours sweeping up broken glass, recommitting ourselves to our neighborhood, very strong idea, and bringing deeply appreciated comfort and care to small business owners, repelling from the violence. The work felt like a mitzvah, nothing less. Now, Adam, Rabbi Kligfeld, sorry.
Okay. I like my first name too.
It's a beautiful one, especially in the context of our conversation, right? It couldn't be better. Now, I have friends that are in LA area that they say that the thing that we need to do is to go into our buildings, evacuate our Torahs, and sit there with guns to make sure that no harm will happen to the Jewish community. Even though you spoke about security, but in the context of having people back. But my friends were talking about securing their buildings and securing the well-being of our structures. And you speak about recommitting ourselves to our neighborhood, and instead of a gun, you took a broom, like Bram. So how that happened, and how did you manage to bring community members with you? How did you manage the internal conversation that probably happened in your congregation, and how you brought, and I will add one more word to this conversation. I think that there is a layer of, in any kind of action, and especially in an action in which you build something and you contribute something, as you were mentioning in the context of the weddings, there's a redemptive side to those actions. So how that happened?
The announcement that flight attendants will say before you take off. Remember flying on planes? Remember when that was a thing that human beings did? Where if in the case of a loss of cabin pressure, put the masks on yourself and then help your children afterwards, right? That you have to take care of yourself first, otherwise you're of no use even to your children. And that's a very counterintuitive thing to do as a parent. Normally we're instinctively putting ourselves in between danger and our children, which brings to mind Rashi's understanding of why the Torah says, Al Kanfein Nesharim, that God brought us out on eagle's wings, because Rashi and the Talmud's understandings of the way eagles carry their young, I don't know if it's correct, is that they carry their young on top of their wings rather than below them, so they put their own bodies in between the archer's arrows and the ones they're protecting. That's a parental instinct, and it's a personal instinct, and it's a human instinct. But again, I like to smash binaries, and I'd rather see them as complexities. So once we woke up Sunday morning and realized that we were okay, and we kind of checked in with every individual. We had one, as far as I know, Sunday morning, we had one Temple Beth member whose business downtown was severely destroyed and looted, and we responded to them. We obviously couldn't fix it for them, but we responded to them. But once we realized that there was no loss of life in our community and no injury in our community, and that the building was intact, we took the oxygen masks off ourselves because we had enough oxygen, as it were, and we said, what's the next thing that we can do? And our neighborhood, our shul is a neighborhood shul. It doesn't mean that everyone in our shul is in our neighborhood, but something like 70 to 80% of the members of our community live within, I would say, 2 to 3 miles of the synagogue. And the neighborhood was in shambles. And so I invited people to get to work, not because it's the only thing for us to do, but because it's a mitzvah that stood in front of us in that moment. It's going to Pirkei Avot, Havei Zariz LaMitzvah. You're supposed to run to do a mitzvah and do the first mitzvah that you can as early as you can. So at 8 o'clock Sunday morning, the first mitzvah that we could do was to gather our weapons, to kind of invoke Isaiah as you were doing, and not our weapons as guns, but our weapons as brooms, and just clean up. And to clean up indiscriminately, meaning we went to every neighborhood business that was impacted in like a half-mile radius of us. We didn't ask what their politics were. We didn't ask, we didn't care what color their skin were. We didn't care if they were for the protest or against the protest. What we saw is that they were frightened. Some of them had spent the night in their businesses trying to protect it. They were devastated, and we cleaned up, not in a preening way, but in a way of suggesting we, your local Temple Beth Am friends, want to be there to help. And the gratitude from some of these business owners was beyond words. They were emotional, thinking that anyone would be thinking of not themselves, but someone else that morning. For us, it just felt like the natural instinct. And I sent an email out, and really within 10 minutes, there was an army of people to help. Now, that night, or I'm getting the days mixed up, maybe the next day, we got an indication that there was concern, no certainty, some concern that the next round of rioting, the next round of protesting that might spill out into rioting, was going to be focusing on more residential, more affluent neighborhoods with potentially some Jewish targets. We had no certainty it was going to happen, but because we got a hint of it, the pendulum had to switch back. We had to put the oxygen mask on ourselves, and we did immediately, in a very strange way. We sent another email out to the congregation, actually just to people who are really close to the synagogue, saying, if you can, come to the synagogue between 1 and 1:30, and we're going to evacuate every Sefer Torah from the building, which we did do, and they're now separated in the homes of members of our community. And we did board up our windows. And it's very strange, Rabbi Nico, right? Our synagogue has been in this campus since the 1930s. It's the first time since 1934 that the corner of La Cienega and Olympic has no Torah scroll in it. It's a very sad thing. I'm going to be potentially going into the synagogue Shabbat morning to live stream our services. And I actually have not been taking the Torah out of the ark, because we've been operating it as a quasi-minyan, we're gathered on Zoom, but we're not operating as a full minyan. We have not been taking the Torah out of the ark, but I'm going to be in a sanctuary that we just dedicated this past September, so that natural light streams in from the outside, but it won't be, because the windows are boarded up, with a beautiful illuminated Arona Kodesh for our Torah scrolls, which will be illuminated but empty. Because we had to put the oxygen masks back on ourselves, because if we are not for ourselves, then who are we, to quote Hillel? If we stay on Hillel's line for a second, the second half of that triplicate wisdom, right? If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? And if I'm only for myself, what am I? If not, now when? That second piece is often translated as, and if I am only for myself, what am I? Actually, I'm not sure that's pshat. I'm not sure that's the best translation of the Hebrew into English. And I think a more precise translation gives a more interesting meaning to what Hillel may have been trying to say. The preposition uchshe in Hebrew is when, not if. Uchshe ani latzmi. When I am focusing on myself, which I'm entitled to do, which I must do, which is self-preservation, which is the first human Darwinian evolutionary instinct. Ma'ani, what am I like? What do I look like as I'm focusing on my own needs? What message am I promulgating out to the world when I'm doing what I ought to be doing, which is take care of myself? Meaning, am I taking care of myself in a way that also evinces a care for others around me? Because I don't think it's just one or the other. It's not just me, you, me, you, me, you. It's me all the time on some level, but while I'm focusing on me and while we are focusing on us, what do we look like? What are we broadcasting out to the wider community in terms of our willingness to step over our own boundaries and outside our own guarded gates into the places where there is literal or figurative broken glass? And am I willing to use my broom for you, even if you don't look like me, even if you don't pray like me, even if you don't think like me? Am I willing to use my broom for you as quickly as I'm willing to use my broom for me?
Wow. Thank you. Thank you for that. And I was thinking while you were speaking, this idea that the definition of the self in Jewish tradition very often has to do with our interaction with another, right? Like a good example of that is the Mechirat Hametz, right? Like that we need to sell our Hametz to a goy, by definition, to someone who doesn't belong to the Jewish people, in order to fulfill the mitzvot, the precepts, the laws of the holiday. We need to be in interaction with others. And so there's a part of our self that cannot be fulfilled if we don't interact, if we don't extend our ties to others in our community. Rabbi, this has been such a great opportunity and a fulfilling and nuanced conversation. So much of this idea of the gam began, of the this and that, came through your words and wisdom. And I would like to, you're a rabbi, so I would like to invite you to leave us. We're going to sing a nigun to conclude our gathering, but we're going to do an inematov, not a nigun, so we all can sing and sing words out loud. But before we do that, Shabbat, Parashat Naso, if there's anything that you want to share with us, any blessing, any word, any piece of wisdom as we walk into this Shabbat, it will be highly appreciated.
Sure. We've been living with this parsha now for 2 weeks because last week was Shavuot, and so we didn't read Parshat Naso, even though it was the next one to be read after the previous week. And Jews, as I like to say, don't just read the parsha, we live the parsha, we live within it. There's always something there in its direct reading or its commentaries that somehow speak really prophetically and presciently to the moment. What comes to mind right now is a beautiful commentary on the second line of the parsha, which eventually gets into some really interesting issues like the sotah, the woman suspected of adultery, and the nazir, the person who takes the vow of asceticism, begins with something a little more banal, perhaps, which is how the Mishkan, the tabernacle, was transported from place to place from all the different locations that the Israelites went between Egypt and the land of Israel. And the task, the schlepping task, for lack of a better word, was delegated to some families within the tribe of Levi. And the beginning of Parshat Naso, they're counted. And the first of the tribes that is asked to be counted, or the sub-tribes, is the tribe of the Gershonites. Naso at Rosh B'nai Gershon. So, Naso at Rosh B'nai Gershon, gam hem. Count the heads of the Gershonites, gam hem, even them. So, Chizkuni, who was a medieval French commentator who lived in the center of France, asks 2 questions on that phrase. Number one, what is the meaning of gam hem? Why also them? Them in addition to whom? And it seemed from later on in the Torah that they actually are not the first ones who are supposed to be counted. The Kohatites are the first ones to be counted because it's the Kohatites who have the very specialized task of breaking down the most important parts of the temple, the Mishkan, the menorah, the shulchan, the altar. They have the platinum job. And so they're the most specialized task, whereas the Gershonites, if you read closely, all they're really doing is kind of babysitting the parts as they are pushed along on wagons, and they didn't even contribute to making the wagons. They were the gifts of the princes. So why are they counted first in Parshat Naso? When the Chizkuni says, is that the reason why the Torah says to look first at the Gershonites is because those are the very people you might so easily overlook, because they don't have the fanciest jobs, and they don't have the highest degrees, and they're not the ones in the center of the most important work of the society, but they count just as much as anyone else. So to counteract your instinct to count them last, to counteract your instinct to focus on the Kohatites, the Torah says you start with the Gershonites. You start with looking at the people you would overlook. You start with counting the people that you might forget to count. You start by raising up the people who could so easily be forgotten and never be raised up, because that is the way the Torah invites us to live out our values. And there are so many applications of that teaching that I won't spell out because I'd rather people spell it out in their own minds. But look for the Gershonites in your midst this Shabbat and lift them up and count them and make them feel as special and as holy as the more obvious ones around you. And Shabbat Shalom.
Yes, good Shabbos. Toda for the wisdom. And in the same context of Parashat Naso and this conversation about the Mishkan, it's important to remember that there is a place for each of the tribes around the Mishkan, okay? With their opinions, with their feelings, and all of us count. We need all of them for the minyan. and in order to be able to move forward in our journey as a people. So we will conclude this gathering first thanking you once again, Rabbi, and singing the words of Ine ma tov umanaim shevet achim gam biachad. How wonderful is for us, for the diversity of tribes of the people of Israel, to gather and to sing together with our differences, with our unique gifts, but together. Hine ma tov umanaim shevet achim gam biachad. Hine ma tov umanaim shevet achim gam biachad. הנה מה טוב ומנעים שבת אחים גם יחד. 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 Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Toda Rabbi to all those that participated in this gathering, and to the Jewish Federation of Orange County for creating this platform for sharing and for conversation and for thinking. Shabbat Shalom.